Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Go Beyond. We are live from the Treach Studio. My name is Alyssa Robinson, and I am here with our senior pastor, Daniel Humbert. And Go Beyond is simply a time that we dig deeper into the message from Sunday, and I get to ask some extra questions that popped into my head while I'm worshiping on Sunday. So I hope that you enjoy this time with us, and if you missed worship, go through our videos, catch up with us on what we talked about this week. This week was all about fasting for commitment, and we were in the book of Ezra, which I am the first to admit, I have not spent a lot of time in the book of Ezra.
You would not be alone.
And so we're going to dig into this a little bit more. But my first question today, and I'll put a little context around it, is what is your but first in your relationship with God? Because one of the things that Daniel told us on Sunday is the but first is not about like backing in, but first, but it is about, hey, I want to grow my faith in God, but first I need to get my finances in order. But first I need to get my physical wellness, or but first I need to do this. And all of these but first get in the way of our commitment to God. So what is your personal but first?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for introducing that, because it was so funny how many comments I got after the service that, and I kind of knew that was going to come, but I didn't really prepare for it. So it was hilarious to hear people's responses.
He calls it but first syndrome.
That's right. The but first syndrome. Yeah. You got to explain that stuff, right? So I think if I'm honest, mine is highly similar to most, which is simply the busyness of life. If, whether it's getting chores done at the house or whether it's getting work done, my work, like your work, happens to be ministry, but it can sometimes get in the way of a relationship with God. We've had that conversation before. So a lot of it is just sort of allowing the busyness of life to step in and creep is what I refer to. It's just kind of a creep. But I think if I'm honest, my but first is selfishness. Selfishness is, for me, thinking that what I need to do in my head, or sometimes even in my heart, is more important than my relationship with God, or feeling as though whatever these things are that I think need to be done have more value to me than my relationship with God. And the reality is, in my life, that leads to emptiness and even a sense of isolation that can eventually lead to burnout. And so my but first is just the stuff of life. I don't know that I could pinpoint any one thing, but that's what gets in my way.
I think that my but first is probably finances. So I use that as an example. So I've shared with you, back when we were talking about a path worth taking and trying to increase our giving, for the first time in 2019, I reached a full tithe. And I've stayed there where I am giving 10% of my income to God each month. But man, it stresses me out every single month. And so far, I haven't, taken away from that money, but I'm so worried all the time of, am I going to make ends meet this month?
Wow.
And of course, with the freeze, I had 3 pipes burst, and I have insurance adjusters coming to the house, and now I'm going to have that extra money coming in. And so I think it's very tempting for me in my but first to be like, okay, but first let me figure out these finances, as opposed to trusting that God's going to take care of all of it. I'm going to be okay. And I am so spoiled in the fact that I have a loving family who supports me. And, I know I will never be homeless. I will never be hungry. I will never be these things because of that. And God has provided an abundance for me. But I still, for me, it's the money.
Yeah.
Money is the but first.
Yeah. I think it's important that we own that, right? That we have this but first. And then, like many other things, once we can identify it, then we can work on it. So.
All right. So my second question today, when we were reading through the book of Ezra, you were talking about they were worshiping by giving sacrifices of, 75 animals and all of these things. And you made the comment, worship looked really different to them than it does to us today. And I think that throughout the pandemic, as a church, we've been having the conversation, how do we define worship?
Yeah.
What is worship? Because maybe somebody considers this time of Go Beyond their worship for the week.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to hear from you. How do you define worship?
Well, I try to define worship by both scriptural and basic definition of what worship is. I mean, the word worship means worthship. And what it further means is to ascribe worthiness, in this case, to God. So if I'm ascribing worthiness to God, what that means is, how do I offer myself to a deity, to a God, to a higher power that I believe honors them and gives glory to them, right? And so that can happen in a formal setting, in a room we call sanctuary, right? And might have certain elements to it. But it can also happen in the car. It can happen at work. It can happen when I'm out in nature. I can ascribe worthiness to God by what I do, what I say. And so worship quite literally just means giving honor to God wherever and however you choose to do that. It happens in a formal communal way in things that we do now on Sunday morning, whether in our homes while we watch an experience or in the room for those who feel comfortable coming. But the reality is our lives ought to be worship to God. That's in part what the Apostle Paul meant when he writes in Romans about to let our, to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. He literally identifies that is our spiritual worship. And so it's really about how we live our lives, literally.
So I mentioned Ezra at the beginning.
This is a book, right?
And I read through our focus scripture for the week, and I was so confused by it because I am not the kind of person, I can't just pick out a piece of scripture and take it at face value and say, okay, well, I can learn something from that. Like, I want to know the full context of what's happening around that.
That's good.
So help me out here. What is the big picture of what's going on with the people in the book of Ezra that called for this like major fast and sacrifice that we talked about on Sunday?
Yeah. So, number one, you're not alone, right? It's good to be in a crew, right? It's good to belong to something. You're not alone because Ezra is confusing. The book is confusing. I won't bore you with too many details, but on a basic level, Ezra is actually combined with the book of Nehemiah. So even though we have separated it in our Christian scriptures, it's written by a single author, probably intended to be a single book, and it was also written at a time later than what its setting is, But ultimately, the book is about, but the two books, is about the Israelite people coming back out of what's known as the Babylonian captivity. At one point, the Israelites got really disruptive. God said, hey, I'm going to put you out. And God sort of pushed them, if you will, into what's known as the Babylonian captivity. So they got pushed into Babylon, stayed there for generations. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are about their coming back. What further confuses it is, there were sort of up to 4 different re-entries back into Jerusalem, back into the Holy Land. And so even in the book of Ezra, you get confused because they're referencing several of those returns. And so you're like, well, what? I thought we already did that, or I thought this happened, all right? And so that part is confusing. But the big picture is we're coming back to Jerusalem to honor and worship God and reestablish what it is we were intended to do, which is to honor God through worship. So the fast, in this case that we referenced in Ezra chapter 8, was about the need to find a way to reconnect and recommit to God. We've been displaced. We can't worship the way we normally worship, which is all that sacrificial stuff, right? Burning animals. They couldn't do that. You can't do that anywhere but in the temple. So we not only need to come back, but we got to rebuild this temple as well. So the fast was a way to start worshiping God, to stop and say, I'm going to abdicate food in this case and focus on you, God. And then through that, we're going to find the strength to come back, to build the temple, and to worship you appropriately.
So is the idea that when they were cast out, they weren't worshiping at all?
They couldn't.
And legally, was that like a Jewish...
Yeah. So unlike our worship, like I just described, where we can worship anywhere, right? We can honor and ascribe worth to God anywhere. In Jewish worship, the only proper way to worship God was to slaughter and burn or sacrifice an animal. and only in the temple. So if you didn't have the temple, you couldn't worship God.
I find that so interesting. And that brings even more context to our current state, because a lot of people have felt like they haven't been able to worship for a year. And we offer online worship, we offer in-person worship, but there are some people who they felt completely isolated from worship. And the people in the book of Ezra for generations did not worship.
Right.
Is crazy to me. And then it brings more gravity to the fast and worship experience that we read about in chapter 8. So that was very helpful. Thank you.
Good. Good. Glad to help.
Those are all
Why we
of
go
the
beyond,
questions.
right? Why we go beyond.
Yes, we went beyond. Those are all of the questions that I had today. So thank you, everybody, for joining us for another episode of Go Beyond. I hope that you're a nerd like me and you found some value in the context behind that scripture. And as a reminder, you can catch all previous episodes of Go Beyond at tmumc.org/go beyond. And I would like to invite you to visit our website and go to tmumc.org/Lent, where you can follow along with everything that we have going on during this Empty to Full worship series, including audio devotions. We've got blog posts coming from Pastor Nick every week. We've got all sorts of resources for you to grow deeper in your relationship with Jesus Christ. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
See y'all.
Thank you.